They're well presented. It doesn't matter who says them almost. Um, but I just think this is a really important film. It did win Best Adapted Screenplay. It was adapted from a novel by Miriam, what did I say? Miriam Tabo or something like that. And there was based on a real event of a Canadian Mennonite sect from Manitoba who did settle in Bolivia, not Brazil. And very rural, isolated area. So they were like their own universe. And this actually did happen. And the men were finally prosecuted and convicted of these crimes. And I think this is just it consolidates so many ideas about how women are bound by culture and tradition, and how hard it is to break through conventional thinking. That is the culture of a religion. And of course, we've seen that in the Catholic Church, in Orthodox Judaism. We see it in Asian cultures where women are subjected to a lesser position of authority. So it's emblematic of humanity and history. So I think it's very important, resonates today, even though the book was set in the 1980s. It really helps articulate how some women, such as women who are the victims of abuse, spousal abuse or boyfriend abuse, are trapped in that relationship and can't get out. And it's an intellectual trap as well as a concern for their physical health and their lives. But they're connected, of course. And this film, I believe, illustrates how there is this conflict between what religion is meant to do and what it can actually accomplish in the wrong hands, or the bad it can do, and how the culture of a religion is different from the fundamental beliefs, how there's so much interpretation that it drifts off the central tenet of take care of the widow, the starving, the hungry, the naked, the sick, and the poor, which is kind of fundamental to both Christianity and Judaism and Islam. Those are all some of the pillars of Islam. So I don't really have any particular take on it. I think it was, for what it is, as talky as it is, I think it was extremely well written. And even though the women are speaking the language of their church and the antiquated English of this German-based Mennonite sect, I still think there was an awful lot of humanity that came through in these really terrific performances. These characters lived as people for us, not as actors feigning an accent or feigning a devotion. And their real conflicts, where they were torn, really they made evident even when they weren't speaking about it. So who wants to help me out and start out with their feedback on the film? Anybody? Did it move you? Was it just an intellectual exercise? Mona, unmute and unload.
I found it tremendously moving. I thought the performances were so truthful, nuanced, very unassuming, very modest. I was impressed with the economy of it. There was nothing that was it didn't push. It was just women talking in the most dire circumstances. I had wildly mixed feelings about some of what they were talking about, because on the one hand, I thought this community of men sounded like some of the worst bunch of men anywhere on the planet. I mean, I thought, how could they permit this systematic abuse to go on? The way these women were talking, it was as if there wasn't a single male adult member of this community who either was not directly involved in the abuse or knew about or knew
Knew
about
about
it. They all had to know about it. And when the older woman, who is so wonderfully played by Judith Ivey,
Agata, the mother, yeah.
yeah, well, when she was describing how she'd given birth to 13 children and never once asked a man to pass the salt, never once asked, could her husband put his hand in the small of her back to help her a bit during labor. I thought, what is wrong with these guys? I mean, I'm sure they're primitive tribes on the face of the earth where the men, are helping their women through
Right.
childbirth and not treating them like things. But on the other side of my brain, I was thinking how very fortunate I am to live now, because the life of women for most of time has been a life without control, without education, without agency, without birth control. I mean, our lives have been completely revolutionized by so many things that happened in the 20th century.
Are you talking about Borough Park in Brooklyn, or are you talking about Bolivia in the 1980s, or Pakistan or Afghanistan, under the Taliban?
Yeah, no, the Taliban is certainly comes to mind. I do think that, and then I found myself thinking, well, come on, the Germans were considered the most sophisticated, cultured, best educated people in Europe, but they embarked on a campaign to eradicate the Jewish people.
Right.
You can be educated and not have a shred of humanity. So
Right.
I thought the combination of the illiteracy, the way the church closely defined their roles and would not permit any kind of deviation from those roles. I mean, these women were really caught in a tough
But
situation.
you notice they never refer to a male leader of the group. It's like, it's not a cult of personality. And I know this from Jim Jones and People's Temple, but Heaven's Gate and other cults, it was rife with sexual abuse among people. And it's one of the women, I think it was Ona, who said, we don't have any words to talk about our bodies. So we didn't talk about this abuse amongst ourselves very much because we had no words for it. So that's how the culture silently controls people and betrays their best interests, because of the taboo of talking about this. And the men just ran away with privilege. I mean, I don't know how it's possible, but it clearly was here, and it has been elsewhere. Some of the few holdout Mormon families where one man has several wives that still exist, but are diminishing in numbers now. And it's as a man, I can't apologize for any of that kind of behavior, only to assume that human beings have this capacity to harm each other. And where there's no resistance, it's like an invitation to transgress. And the religion itself and the culture of the religion, so I make the distinction between fundamentally being a Mennonite or an Amish person or an evangelical is one thing, and how it's actually practiced and interpreted by local leaders is something entirely different. And it was like a runaway train. And one of the interesting parts of it was their concern for the young boys. And August, has the speech about young boys are really horrible and capable of a lot of bad stuff, but they're educable and they can be taught. And that's what I'll do. So I think they should go with you. Don't leave your boys here, because they're worth changing. They're worth fighting for. And that, that was a really important thing to say, at least from my perspective as a somewhat enlightened man. Anybody else? Joel?
I agree with everything as presented, and the abuse that the women were had to endure was unconscionable. But just as the story flowed, I was just wondering why you never saw the adult men, the abusers, or any of the other group, and they were just freely left at the end. So that just didn't make
I can explain that. They said most of the men went to town to raise money for the bail of those who were incarcerated. The only man left, we get the impression, is August. And
I got that, but it took them a few days to make
Right.
the decision, and then another few days to get their act together, to get the wagons, to get out of there.
took them over. It was just one day. They knew they had till the next day to decide.
Okay, my wife Helene wants to say something.
Yeah.
When I was watching, I was fascinated by the dialogue between the women. One woman trying to convince the group.
Yep.
And it brought to mind 12 Angry Men.
Uh-huh. Sure.
Because I think it was sort of that same kind of group dynamics, that one person can make a difference.
I think you're right, but in the case of 12 Angry Men, most of the men were indifferent and didn't know how to think, how to get to a verdict, except for Henry Fonda, who said, we owe this guy a chance. Here, they went into that meeting already divided. Some were very opinionated, some were too scared to have an opinion. There were, and if you look at the, I thought it was beautiful the way they voted. They just marked an X in one of 3 columns. At the top of each column was a picture representing your position. I mean, it says a lot about the state of literacy and women's awareness of issues beyond getting the meal ready for the men and birthing babies. So, it's a little bit different, but you're right. They did sway each other. And these were, from what I gathered, from what I read, there's 3 families represented. There were 3 generations, grandma, mother, and children represented there. There were only the 2 older women that I saw, Agatha, Judith Ivy, the queen bee, and then the lady with the glasses and the skinny face, who was Sheila McCarthy, Greta.
But one more issue. You said the men were all away, but I thought that the defining moment was when the woman came back who had been abused again and
Right.
only revealed what they were doing because her child was being beaten.
Right.
And-
Her husband, Klaus, they say, came back to get the horses. He came back drunk to get more collateral for money to free the others. He was going to go back. And she thought staying away would let on to him that they were thinking of leaving. So she went into the house. And that's when she got beaten and the daughter got beaten. Does that help?
Yeah, but that swayed the group.
Ona had turned already before that. Ona all along had been talking about, well, if we go, it will be this way. She was considering what would happen to the boys. Would we be free or not? And then there's this notion of forgiveness. Ona says, and we can come back to this because I think it's really important. Is forgiveness really forgiveness if it's forced? Doesn't have to come deep within your soul. And it's a great point. And it reminded me of the film we saw recently, Survivor, about the guy who had to box for the amusement of Nazi officers in the camps. And somebody says to him, you didn't have a choice. It's like you're not responsible because nobody should have ever forced that choice upon you. The choices weren't created by you. They were created by somebody else. So it wasn't a choice. So you can't blame yourself. Like Sophie's choice is predicated on that. Which child does she send off to the gas chamber? I think that's a powerful concept. And we often, talk about responsibility for our choices, but so many of them are not of our own making. The choice of poverty isn't something anyone would make, even though some arch conservatives would say it is. The poor are to blame for their own poverty. It's awful things like that still abide in our culture, and it's masked in the guise of American exceptionalism and independence, and not in my backyard, and live free or die. This libertarian misconstruction of American democracy and the obligations we have to each other. It's still very much with us, and it amounts to blatant selfishness now. Oh, we have two hands raised, Frank and then Steve.
Okay, two things. The dialogue was exceptional, and if you know, there was never a vote. It was like a consensus and a rationale and groupthink when they came to the decision that they had to leave. Never a vote. And the discussion earlier about when the women came back abused freshly, they had made the decision to leave already before that. This just reinforced it.
Yeah,
Going back to that wasn't if they were equivocating, maybe it just reinforced it. But the group decision had been made before that.
Right.
I actually had to look at it again because it intrigued me how it was directed and how the consensus was developed and how it evolved. It was truly groupthink.
Yeah, but I tried to track each character's point of view as it changed throughout the day and the evening, and I couldn't, partly because of the identification of who the relationships and who they were, and also a lot of them said mixed things, like Una, who wanted to stay and fight, but then she said, wait a second, if we go, we can do this or we can do that. It's like it was a moving target for all of them, although some were clearly made up, and like Frances McDormand, she just leaves because no, we can't leave.
Jim, your playbill that you sent really helped and explained, but you didn't get that from the film itself.
No, I went online.
Yeah, but it certainly helped, and you wonder why. Did it knowing the relationships that the mother had and the two antagonists, the two women who were at each other were really sisters, that helped explain some. And it's interesting that wasn't made clear in the movie.
I found it a flaw in the film because it was, I'm sure, clear in the book, and it was clear to Sarah Polley, who wrote the script for it. And sometimes filmmakers get lost in their own perceptions, and they don't take care of the audience's needs to be as clear as they. I watched it both times with subtitles so I could read the names, and it helped only marginally.
The one final question, I was trying to figure out what the girls kept walking or running through the fields, and I couldn't identify the crop. What was that they were growing?
I don't know. It was shot in Canada, so it could have been corn or oats. It
was not corn. Maybe oats. I don't know what oats looks like. Okay.
But it was a real field. Obviously, it wasn't all CGI, and it was all Canadian crew. And it was about a Canadian story because there was this cult in Canada that moved to Bolivia. Steve Zimmerman.
Okay, thanks. I enjoyed it a lot. I thought it was nicely shot. I love the facial expressions throughout the movie. It was so reminiscent of the faces of photographers during the Dust Bowl era and so forth. It just what they were experiencing and feeling. I love the sepia tone, sort of the color. Which sort of gave it an unworldly feel and echoed their inner feelings that they were, in a way, not leading a real life, that they were divorced from their bodies, they were divorced from reality, what they were going through. and they were almost washed out semblances of humanity, given what had happened. I thought the more insightful or penetrating comments came in the last, say, third of the movie in their discussions, focusing on pacifism and faith, and an interesting point about education. I thought that was very penetrating at the end when the women came to realize that it wasn't just the males who were being who were good students, but the females also absorbing the indoctrination
Right,
were
yeah.
also very good students.
My mother taught me well too.
I thought that was a great line.
Yeah, let's come back. Let's come back to that. I do want to address your comment about the color, and it's a very Spartan-based culture, like the American Amish community, that don't have colored clothes. Everything's very drab. That's because color is considered a selfish indulgence. The Amish women did kind of violate that when they made their colorful quilts from patches of rags. But it reflected the puritanical nature, the pure nature of, and the suppression of ego. So it's not that so that plays back to what you were saying, Steve. I'm not contradicting you. I'm just saying but I see it as a lack of distraction of earthly pleasures, as well as what you said. Anything else, Steve? Or should we go on to the others?
No, I mean, just for example, I mentioned pacifism, faith, and education or indoctrination. I think that seemed to sway some of the people who are really torn about leaving. The notion of that if you stayed and were violent,
Let's come back to that, because that's the end of the film. But I agree, that's what turned everybody, into a consensus. Steve Miller?
I'll start because it ties into my big point with your comment that isn't really choice if it's forced. I think in the context of these people, it's not forced. They have a belief system that they truly believe, rightly or wrongly. It's been given to them. And if they say they forgive, and they get to go to heaven. And it is a real choice, even if they feel forced into it because of within their belief system. And it ties into the one thing I was surprised not a single one of the women said was that, how do we know these men are properly conveying all of this religion to us? We can't read. They say it's okay to do this. Well, and then in fact, so much so that one woman says, well, we can leave and I want to leave. I'm going to go to hell, but I'd rather have a more enjoyable life on earth before that than worry about what happens and not going to heaven when I die.
Okay, I'm glad you touched on that, because it goes to the center of this film, and that is there's a conflict between the virtues of the church as they've been taught and their tolerance of the behavior from the men, right? And that's why this notion of pacifism turns them. We'll come back to that. But it's unfair. Yes, it's part of their religion, but did they have a choice? Does some Orthodox girl in Meir Sharin in Israel have a choice about going to college? No. Does she have a choice about how many children to birth? No. And yet they're passionate Jews. And in Brooklyn, the Satmar sect of Hasids, their big threat is, we'll banish you. You'll have nobody if you do this, or if you leave, or we'll take your children from you. And that's the conflict. They don't allow somebody to interpret the religion in a way that's meaningful to them and stay true to it according to their own conscience. You know, that's what's wrong with fundamentalism. There is no deviation, which doesn't allow for all of the human condition. And so I say they didn't have a choice because they were illiterate. They didn't read Christian literature. They didn't read anything. They were exposed to this culture that was more smothering than anything else and deprived them of so much of what Reformed Judaism would call what is divine in humanity, which is the ability to see nuance and reason and see both sides of a story. Yes, forgiveness is a big part of Judaism. But these women didn't have the advantage of that kind of open-minded spirituality or religion that allowed them to think for themselves. So they were set up to fail as independent thinkers. So that's why I forgive them. You know, maybe I'm splitting hairs with this, Steve. I don't really mean to, but it's important. You can't say that they got what they bargained for, because they didn't bargain for this. They've never been challenged in this way before.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is you said that is their forgiveness real if they don't really mean it and feel forced into it.
That's a line from the movie.
And yeah, and I think in fact it is only because they know that they're doing it within their own belief system, right or wrong, and they believe in that system.
Okay,
and that's not to say they're not thinking, and it's and
no, I understand, but you see, they've been raped. The woman who said that, Ona, was raped by an unnamed man, and that sets up a conflict. That's a real world situation that the religion didn't provide for. You know, there are no rules about you forgive your rapist. It's just you must forgive everybody else or you won't go to heaven. And it's impossible to deny that you were raped. And worse than that, according to one of the other women, is when your child is raped or beaten. There's a mention of a 4-year-old being raped or abused, sexually abused in the film. It's like there are things that go beyond ego and selfishness. When a mother's love and concern for the welfare of their child is challenged by their own faith or people who say they're acting according to God's will, that's crazifying. You know, you can't resolve those two. And that's what the movie's about, is how do we get past this thing that's totally reprehensible to us and tolerate it? It's just gone on too long. So there's mass rebellion there. So yeah, I understand what you were saying, but it's this notion of the conflict between practice and theory of religion, you know, practice and core value, where the core value can be twisted, you know, into male dominance, for one thing, or male, I don't know. I can't.
That's where I'm disagreeing with you, because you're saying that's a twisting. And what I'm saying is, in the world of this community, it isn't a twisting. That's the religion. You may not like its precepts, but I think part of that is the religion as they understood it, rather than a twisting of what we believe the religion should be or is outside this community.
Yes, some are willing to forgive, but if you're raped or if your daughter is raped, it's very hard to forgive that. And that is not in the rule book. These women have not been instructed in such a situation because it's not talked about. You know, part of what goes hand in hand is this purity of the soul and spirit and devotion to God only. You know, the song they keep singing, you know, closer to thee, you know, is about ignoring anything else, you know, including the facts. And so let's just say the women were mortal in that they had such a visceral reaction to the abuse that they couldn't go along with the tenets of their faith as they understood it.
That I don't disagree with at all.
Okay, right. But it's like, this is the conflict that the film sets up, that the story sets up, is how does a loving mother tolerate this? And a loving mother can't. You know, whether you have 13 kids or 2 that are living now, it's, you know, it's intolerable. Risa, your hand is raised.
Yes. You know, I really wasn't interested in trying to separate the women. It took me about 15 minutes to
Yeah.
figure out that I wasn't going to be able to separate one from the other.
Yeah.
And it didn't matter. What they were saying mattered, and it didn't matter who was saying it. And that happened because they went back and forth and they were really thinking it through. But the choice part of it, when you compare it to the Hasidim, and it really is a good comparison. We've been following over the past 20 years many stories of women who make the choice to leave as individuals. I've never heard of an entire community of women leaving. That I haven't seen. But on the other hand, the rape, the abuse of women and children goes on in the Hasidic community completely.
Yeah.
And you have tshuva, which is forgiveness with the promise that you will change your behavior. And that doesn't exist in this situation at all. So they leave, and I think it's a powerful decision for a group like that to leave.
Mhm.
And then I was curious, and we don't know, the woman who left the group and said she's definitely not leaving, did she leave when they all left? Were there any women left at
Yeah.
all?
The woman who had two daughters who went back into the home with her, and then the daughters joined the caravan. But
They
not-
joined the caravan, but we
The
didn't
daughters
see
did,
the
but the
mother.
mother
Yeah,
didn't.
we didn't see the mother do that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me. I thought it was beautifully done. I found myself agreeing with both sides of the story while they were discussing it, because everything was backed up very well by their emotion and their words. I thought it was extremely well done.
Yeah, it was well reasoned, and even though there were different voices talking, the point is the words were said, the issues were parsed really well,
Really well.
and that's what we need to hear is how, you know, what are the choices these people face, and there were different choices, and because they're all different. Iris, you had something to say? Quite a bit. Yeah, you're muted, Iris. We want to hear it all.
The point that you were just making about Frances McDormand's character, Scarface Jane. I thought a lot of people said to me, and some Twitter remarks that I saw were, what was her purpose in this movie? You know, what was her purpose? She was just stood there, this almost stoic woman willing to accept what
Right.
was done to her. And so to me, she represented all of the fear that they were trying to overcome
Mhm.
and make that decision. I mean, she did not have the courage to make that decision.
Mhm.
And that, to me, that lack of courage, which, you know, sometimes I think about myself, you know, there's a lot of things I would be afraid to do. This would have been leaving everything she knew
Mhm.
and making the choice to try and make it like these other women did.
Mhm.
And you wonder, really, where were they going? I don't know that she knew or they knew.
And it
Well-
was a very isolated place. I mean, hours on horseback, if
Yeah.
not days. You know, they had to sustain themselves on the road.
Right.
For a
And
long
the victory for me, for her, was when she didn't stop her children from leaving.
Yeah. She's old school, you know, and she's a foil and an example against the other women.
Well, and you wonder about the scar. I wondered
Yeah,
about the scar in her face and what.
it was totally unnecessary. Just her looks alone and her performance alone would have carried what the character felt and did. And it seemed a little incongruous to me that in a community like that, that would be somebody's nickname. you know. They're more reverential than that. Now, you brought something up about the future and their bravery. And at the very end, Ona says, hope of the having hope for the unknown is better than hating the present.
Mhm.
You know, and so that's you know, at that point she's already decided, but she says, we have to do this, and we have no choice. I don't want to live in that world because I'll hate myself for staying. Well, let's dive in and talk about that pacifism, because that really is the fulcrum on which the film turns very late. And what is pacifism to them? Anybody want to take that on? That's an easy one.
It's almost like Quakerism. I
Yes.
mean, and it's set up the basic contradiction. The character played by Claire Foy, Salome, I think her name was.
Salome. They call her Salome.
Okay. She's full of rage, of course.
Yes.
Tremendous amount of anger and ready to lash out, ready to kill, actually. But it was a contradiction when she was confronted with that you can't stay and kill people. That's what you're going to end up doing. You're not going to convince anybody. You'll probably kill and or be killed. That seemed to penetrate finally to some of them. And, you know.
Okay. But it extends to the others as well, because she couldn't control it. You know, she might have killed him, but for the other women, the point is, I cannot place myself or my children in an atmosphere of violence because that makes me a collaborator.
Mhm.
You see, so that means I am not being a pacifist. Leaves the field, has nothing to do with perpetrating, causing any violence. And by exposing themselves to this, because they did say the men are going to keep doing this. There's no authority in, you know, the guys got out on bail, and we know what happens in courts. It would have continued. And so Ona, I think, is the one who says, you know, Agata, the mother says, yes, we can't allow you to kill anybody. We can't allow you to hate yourself. You know, you must leave. She goes to the opening in the hayloft, and she's thinking and contemplating and meditating on it. She comes back, and that's her decision, that this is part of pacifism. You have to extract yourself from this environment. And it's not just because you'll kill anybody, but you're exposing your child to it. So you cannot be a perpetrator of even a silent person, you know, standing by. And this, you know, we saw this in a film we saw 2 years ago, Gentleman's Agreement, where Gregory Peck says, the problem is all you people who don't say anything and let it go on. You know, that's the problem. And, you know, we see that today too, in today's culture and society, is that how can thoughtful, politically conservative people endorse Donald Trump's racist policies? Or how can the Republican Party endorse his racist policies? Or Ron DeSantis more cleverly disguised racist policies? You know, it's like at some point you have to say, I have skin in the game. I have something to say about this, and I'm going to move with my feet, you know. And some people are just remain complacent, as we saw throughout history. You know, what about the Southerners during the civil rights era in the 60s that didn't protest against George Wallace, you know, saying segregation now and segregation forever? It's like, where was the white backlash against that from the South? We never heard of it. I'm sure there were some people. Similarly, look at the movie, another movie we saw. This is how movies can color your whole life if you let them. Soldiers in Blue and Gray, where we saw Jewish families on either side of the Civil War, some slaveholders, some not, some families fighting against each other. it's like Jews are people too, you know, and this is just part of human nature that this is going to happen. Like I said, people fill that void when there's no goodness to fill those cracks in all our broken cells, the Kabbalistic concept of cracks, you know, and the Leonard Cohen concept of that's how the light gets out. There's so many concepts that bring to bear on this situation. And I'm seeing these connections to other films we've discussed because I think they're real. You know, if the films could be as eloquent as we are, it would be great, but we got to connect the dots. And, you know, this film should be mandatory screening for all 15-year-old boys, I guess, or something like that. Any other comments? Frank or Yvette? Come on, Yvette.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Okay, I just wanted to point out the horrible extent of the rapes. The one woman implies that she wasn't sure if it was her brother who raped her, which shows how the extent and of what was going on.
Yeah, it was horrible. I mean, it was like, I don't want to say sport, but the men felt entitled to do this. And because none of the men would betray them. Yeah, Risa.
There were drugs involved.
Yeah, they used.
They drugged them with animal
Tranquilizer.
tranquilizer is the word, right? So that.
I'm sorry. That reminds me of one other thing. Which character was who had to convince her son to go? How did she convince him? She showed this spray.
That's not well explained, but what I've read is that she used drugs.
She used drugs. Okay, I wasn't sure if it was blinding him or something of that sort. Okay.
He didn't resist because he couldn't.
Okay.
You know, and again, it goes to do the means justify the ends? For that mother, it did. So you see, even her pacifism, a core tenet of her religious belief, made her do that to her son. No mother wants to do that. No father wants to do that. And it's another one of those conflicts where you do extraordinary things when circumstances are extreme. You know, even the Jewish partisans in the Polish forest learned how to kill people. They never dream of doing that if it weren't for the Nazis. You know, it's like, and it's all over literature, Lord of the Flies and Clockwork Orange and you know, even 2001. Of course, that's just the apes versus Hal the computer. But it's like people are capable of horrible, horrible things. Chinatown. It's dumped in our laps at the end of the movie Chinatown that Mulholland had sex with one of his daughters. You know, and oh my God. And this was a cultured man. Granted, he was a land baron. So, you know, I people are not inherently evil, but they're capable of evil. That's how I'd like to say it. There's no original sin. Yes, Susie. And then Mona. You're muted, Susie.
I gave it a lot of thought, and it's been brought up by everyone, why the women put up with it, why they stayed so long, what kept them from not organizing sooner. And in my thoughts, it came to me that how can you go out, and they had to have been so brave, because how can you go out in the world without one speck of education when you're grown? You know, when you have to make decisions and you have to go out and you can't read, or you can't write, or you don't. And that scene where the what's his name, the young man, the teacher, when he gave her the map, and said, this is the way you go, and this is the way you go, and this is the way you go. That was a little hard to believe, that one piece of paper with a map was going to get that whole caravan of people to where they needed to go. So, but I think that they didn't have the confidence until they finally got themselves together and were the women talking and talking and talking and getting the courage together to do it, to leave.
Well, you can ask that about any revolution. How long did it take the Muslims, to revolt against the British in India? How long did it take the colonists to stage a tea party? When does a revolution reach its fever point and break out, and infect people with passion?
This wasn't a revolution. This was freedom from the molestation that they were getting in this camp, or whatever you want to call it. And I think I'm trying to defend my position, that one of the reasons they stayed so long was because they didn't have the confidence to leave.
A lot of them didn't. I wouldn't deny that. It's a huge thing that they did, and that's why they didn't do it. They've been told for years, you're just a woman, you're subject to our will. Mona, and then Jeannie, and then we can go back to Steve and Lisa.
The part where the people's relationships became clear to me, I didn't realize that some of these women were siblings.
Yeah.
At the very end of the movie, just from the expression on the face of the slender mother, the one who takes her false teeth out because they don't
Greta.
in her mouth.
That was a good scene.
Oh God, what a performance. She was fantastic, I thought, but I knew that she bitterly regretted that she did not realize that the man her daughter married would be so violent and beat her and treat her so brutally. You could tell from her expression that if she had had the power to see this in him, she would have done everything she could to prevent that marriage. So I could see, and when Frances McDormand's character, Scarface Jane, lets her daughter go, it's like it's going to be the end of her life not to have the daughter and the granddaughter there. But she's also making a huge sacrifice because she doesn't want her daughter and granddaughter to suffer. So the maternal relationships were very clear to me. Unfortunately, I didn't get the sibling relationships.
Problem, we didn't have the understanding of each of them that they had of each other.
Right.
Isn't she the one, Mona, that said, I'm not going to die here, I might hold you up, but I'll be
That was
that was Agatha, the one who engages in this almost Talmudic reasoning process where she distills the fundamental values of their religion, compares them to each other, and then goes through this weighing process in order to persuade them that living with violence is fundamentally inconsistent with their way of life. I found her, there were some things about this that were completely unreal. Rooney Mara's character was so brilliant and insightful and seemed to have so much knowledge despite her complete lack of education. I thought, really, how does this woman know all of this? And I thought, and why is she breaking the poor August's heart? But she said something very interesting. She thought she could never be her own person if she were married. And I thought, okay, well, there have been certainly women for tens of thousands of years who felt exactly that way. It was, that was the only way they could live. And then, she was just incredibly insightful and brilliant. I didn't quite understand why they made the teacher he was like a caricature of gentleness almost. He was effeminate. he was too soft. It was a very interesting performance, but I found it a bit weird. And I thought, well, why is he like this? Is it because he was raised by a mother who was excommunicated? There was this sense that she was destroyed by the excommunication somehow. But I expected him to have more of a backbone. But I mean, it was an act. I thought they were going to kill him at the end. They don't tell you what's going to happen to the school teacher, but I thought, oh, he had that gun for protection.
Yeah, but that was the gun he was planning on killing himself.
Well, that was, I thought, the
Okay.
other woman's interpretation. I wasn't so sure he was going to kill himself. I thought he was prepared to defend himself.
Why did he stay behind? There weren't any kids
to
left.
teach the boys.
No, all the kids went.
No, only the boys under
15.
13 or
15.
something.
Oh, he was staying back to teach the
Teenagers.
teenagers.
Older boys who chose to remain. And, that's his service. And he asked to come back to the community, and he was admitted only because he said he'd teach the boys. So he was useful.
I have a question. How in the world did these women who were raised this way and they saw it prior to getting older, even not accept the fact that raping was okay? They all were angry about it, but they really had no knowledge that it wasn't okay. And I can't figure out where they got this knowledge. And also my other question is, where do they think they're going? They're going somewhere, but there they are. They know nothing. They can't read a map, but they're going. I mean, maybe I'm too logical in my thinking.
I think you are. It was an emotional choice. They had no alternative. They didn't know where they were going. And remember, hope in the unknown is better than resentment in the present. There's also a very poetical line at the very end when Greta, the skinny older woman, tells the second story about her horses. And she was always afraid of their going off the side of the road because there were a lot of gullies.
Yeah, and the gap and looking ahead.
And she said, look, when you look ahead and see, you have your eyes on the big picture, you're more grounded in the current picture.
Yeah.
So that's a metaphor for their decision to leave. Jeannie.
Well, a couple things. The movie just shook me to my core because it wasn't what I expected. And so afterwards, I spent time reading about it online. And I was reading about the journalist who broke the story and went and lived in that community for a while. I don't know if any of you saw that online. And I thought that was fascinating. Then I was reading further that their garments, the women's clothing, was made from fabric bought by the shops in these communities. And that's where their clothing came from, is they bought the fabric. I thought that was interesting. But the part about that I find is women leaving. How many of you have ever been in a bad marriage or whatever? And some women stay because it's easier to stay and they have the fear of the unknown. And some women go and just say, forget it, I'm leaving and I'm just going to figure out what I'm going to do. Look at the women that leave in Central America that just follow these lines and pay this money after they've been raped and abused, and they come through the border and they walk through water and they're carrying their babies. And I mean, all these are similar scenarios. The difference is that this was a group of women that could logically discuss it.
And cohere.
Right, versus women independently going, okay, I've got to get out of this no matter what it takes, and I'm going to leave. So, I mean, women are really, really resilient. And I think that's what I got out of the movie, is the resilience of women in such horrific conditions, that they just said, wait a minute, we got to do this. We're going to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that it is based loosely on a true story made it even more fascinating to me.
Well, it almost doesn't matter. The premise is that these Mennonite women left their men behind, and the writer did the heavy lifting, I think, in terms of parsing out various points of views and moving them consistently through some method of transformation to a common conclusion.
The screenwriter was brilliant,
Well, that
brilliant,
was Sarah Polley. She adapted the book herself.
brilliant.
Yeah, but maybe the book was brilliant too. Maybe he helped her out. I hope so. Because without examining this made the movie. The book was probably less dramatic. Risa, did you have something to add again?
Yeah, excuse me. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking about what's going on in Israel today, because we've made this comparison with Judaism, the cults within Judaism, if you will.
This woman
What's going on right now with, if you will, the rebellion of the people. They have never come out on the streets the way they are now every Saturday night. And I'm afraid of the violence that could happen when they are attacked by, no, I don't want to say the government, but by, when they're attacked, stop. Whatever it is that's going to happen, it's not going to be pretty. And it worries me, because how do people break out of this? And what does it do to what's left? And what was good about this community that had it there together for so many years? And then one of the things that I read about the story behind the movie and the book is that this had only been going on for 4 years. The community was very much older than that, but something changed, or a leader among the men changed. And this was a shall we say, a recent thing that was happening to them. And it was not their whole lives that all this rape and beatings were happening.
How long had they been in Bolivia? So,
well, I don't know how long they had been in Bolivia, but I know that I don't know, but I read that it was 4 years before the previous 4 years to this leaving was different than what had been prior to that.
Yeah. I wonder if leaving relatively civilized Canada, of course, Manitoba is pretty sparse too, had something to do with it, that they were outside the eyes of a watchful civilization, although
right.
Cults tend not to believe in anything but their own world, so I don't think they care what other people think. Steve Zimmerman?
Yeah, just a couple things. Yeah, I assume, I didn't read any of the background, go online, or I just took the movie as a presentation in itself. I mean, I assume there was a fair amount of creative writing and imagination that went into the dialogue and the analysis of positions by different characters and so forth. Given their, someone kind of touched on this, given the intensity of their indoctrination within this group, I mean, it is a remarkable story, rather feministic, that they were able to overcome this fear. There must have been a greater faction who was reluctant to go than just with the one character played by Frances McDormand. But somehow they, I mean, and in other words, I guess there must have been some independent thinking present that hadn't been extinguished by what they had gone through in this group, because they were willing to lash out, in some respects, and say, we've had enough and this can't go on. And so it is kind of a feministic statement, almost, the word manifesto occurred to me, but they, I mean, where did that come from? Risa is suggesting, well, it was perhaps a more recent level of violence that had been inflicted on them that pushed them that way. And maybe that's true. I didn't read the background. But there did seem to be some independent thinking, elements of independent thinking among those women, despite what they had experienced.
Let's go to Howard, and then I have some examples, Steve, of that. Howard, unmute.
Hi. I actually, for some reason, after watching this, I wanted to know more about the background. And if you dig around for a while, there is a huge amount of information about this event, although everything is murky. In fact, I think what I learned about what was going down there in Bolivia was more interesting than the movie, really. So what happened? Some of the things that happened. Okay, so these Mennonites, they're they were living in Canada. Then Canada didn't let them run their own affairs anymore, so they had to leave. They went to Mexico. They were living in Mexico for a long time. Then Mexico said, "Oh no, you can't. We have to apply Mexican law to you." So then they found Bolivia. They moved to Bolivia. I don't know how many years they were in Bolivia, but I'm pretty sure it was I don't know how long it was. It was more than 4 years. And so they had this patriarchal society. The whole thing's run by the men. The women don't vote at all. The bishops run everything. They have total power over everything except murder. The authorities would insist on prosecuting murder. And also in this case, they actually brought the 9 men to the authorities to prosecute for rape. So, you can hear the prosecutor and read about her talking about how sure she was that this really did happen. And they're still in jail, or at least they were still in jail when these videos I watched. One of the prime but the problem is it's very murky because these people the women normally would not talk to outsiders at all. The only way that these reporters claim they got information was that the female reporter lived with them for a while and gained their confidence, and then she got information. But still, a lot of people would say that since not being a virgin was having had sex out of marriage was a complete scandal to the family and makes the daughter unmarriageable. And also was very, very bad to scandalize people with stories that you really in a way can't believe what the women say. So then there's a whole other line of thought that says that allegations, which may or may not be true, might be fishy, that these guys were framed and this story, which is very improbable, actually, when you think about it, about being able to use anesthesia to anesthetize the whole family without killing any of them and then raping them later on and nobody remembers and all that. Maybe that's not true, or maybe it is true, who knows? And that actually, it turns out when you look more into this Mennonite culture, that incest is a really big force in their society. Of course, it's completely hidden, but the reporters found out about it, that it's going on a lot. And so it could be that some of this is to cover up for incest, to frame these men and say they did it. That's why these daughters got pregnant, So they educate their girls and their boys up to the age of 12 for girls and 13 for boys. So the girls do know how to read a little bit. And the other thing is there's no evidence that there's no evidence out there in the actual real world that the women got together. I mean, there may have been some women that got together and talked about it. Basically, they all stayed and they're all there. There's one family that did want to leave and they have left. They haven't left physically. They still have their farm because of issues about money between them and the community, but they're still there. And So the author of the novel says that what she did was she's imagining what would have happened if some women had gotten together and talked about leaving. Who talked and who didn't talk, who wanted to leave, who didn't want to leave. That was all her imagination. So
I know, isn't it wonderful?
that's what I learned.
Well, great. There was a title at the very beginning of the movie during the shots of the field that says, "This is an act of the female imagination."
Well, yeah, that's what she said. That's what the author said in
Yeah.
the,
So
it's
like,
probably her.
that's why I don't do that kind of research into these things, because the truth doesn't really concern me. It's what's the intention of
This is always the conversation that you and I have, and
I know.
I need to articulate my position, which you've misrepresented.
No, I'm glad you do, but
I'd like to explain. I'm not saying that it has to be true, but to me, if somebody makes up a story and the story doesn't, it has to, in some sense, it has to ring true. And some of these, well, I'm not going to make any judgment about the movie. The movie, I mean, Brad Pitt was one of the producers, so we know that it's got to be women's liberation, 100%. And you know, I'm not saying the movie is bad or good, and or that it's bad because it's not based on facts. That would be silly. I'm saying, judge, but you have to understand, you can't say that, you have to understand that a lot of the questions that were raised by people here have to do with the fact that this is actually an imagined dialogue. It's not a real dialogue.
well, I say that's the problem with the author then, that she didn't create a convincing set or mise en scène or intellectual context for all this
That's what
to
I'm
justify their behavior.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay, but
That's what I'm saying.
it doesn't mean that it's useless as an instrument of imagination.
It was all the critics loved it. So
the focus was dialogic. The focus was on the dialogue. They didn't want to bury the audience with acts of violence.
Well, you
they
can't.
left it all in the background.
It's like you can only. There's a certain economy to filmmaking where you have to give the audience what they need to know and no more. And if they don't trust you and they don't go along with the premises you put before them, you've lost them. But conscientious filmmakers, and she certainly is. And by the way, she was a documentary filmmaker before this. She's very much aware of credibility and veracity and creating an environment that's believable. And my hunch is that if you had not done that research, that you might be a little easier on the film and say, gee, it brought up a lot of good concepts about women's struggle and how history and religions have not been kind to them. And for me, that's enough for a film to accomplish. Maybe I just don't like to burst my own bubble when I see the creative and emotional intent of the filmmaker. Maybe I give them too much credit, or maybe I'm just, fill in the blanks too well on my own, so I don't need that reassurance. But it's the value of art is in where it pushes us to. And if, you have to let it push you somewhere, you let yourself be seduced by it to see what you might get out of it. Yeah.
Do you feel that there's anyone who learned anything about the women's struggle by watching this movie?
I certainly did. It gave me incredible insights into how a woman might tolerate this abuse and might not want to leave it, how they're trapped in these horrible relationships, usually because of the deprivation of their education, their economic deprivation, their inability to have the tools to succeed on their own.
Well, in this story, the reality story, or at least what I got as a reality from watching the internet stuff, they actually have an interview with one of the residents, one of the people who was raped, I'm not sure, who said, and this is their doctrine, if these men who are in prison now after 10 years, said they did it and apologized and promised not to do it again, I would forgive them and accept them back into the community. That's the way, that was the way they were taught, and that's the way they believed.
Well, it's interesting to note, and I could believe it, you know, that they would have, I mean, who knows what independence did to them, although to that one, she said, I'd still be willing to forgive.
That's what she said, and the reporter said that is their approach to everything. In fact, in general, some other people said, if you steal, then the elders will excommunicate you and banish you. And then if the next Sunday you say, I'm sorry, I did it and I won't do it again, you're back in. That's the way they do things in that community.
Well,
Which
you
is
can see why the women rebelled against it. And it was a rebellion.
It was about time.
Right.
Except that they didn't rebel against it, is the funny.
It was an act of defiance, even if they meant it as an act of salvation.
But in reality, the women just stayed. And that's also because part of their religion is, in order to get to heaven, besides hard work, you also have to suffer. So this was sent by God, and they just have to.
Oh, it's horrible. That kind of religion is just horrible. It's oppressive. I totally agree.
That's their religion.
But the writer is saying, for women to do this, to summon the communal courage to leave like this, they have to process all these conflicting emotions.
But there
The
was
fact is they left.
there was no communal courage.
If the story is fundamentally correct, they packed up and left. I mean, that's
No,
the
but
fact.
the actual story is that mostly they didn't leave.
But so what? I mean, that
Plenty
point
of other
is,
Mennonites have left. There's
Okay.
informed Mennonites, which
it's
are
just a jumping off point, Howard, for an artist's imagination. Brad?
Yeah, I have a couple other points that, and I'll try to be short because I have 3 points. Number one, that final scene where they're leaving, I don't know if it's because I've got Passover on the brain, but I couldn't help
Exodus.
but think of the Exodus out of slavery. Point number one, I don't know if I was the only one that had that reaction or not, but I'd be curious. Point number two, I think the challenge that the director had in this movie is, how do you get an emotional engagement from the spectator when you're not just dealing with 1 or 2 main characters, you're dealing with a cast of characters, and you're really not getting deeply into any one particular character. So I think that was a challenge, and I'm not exactly sure how successful the director was, or how successful any director could have been with that particular challenge. And then the third point I wanted to make was, in all of the discussions that the women had, what was absent was any practical discussion about, how are we going to survive out there? We can't read. I mean, these are the issues that battered women typically are faced with. The practical side of all of a sudden being out there on their own without resources, without skills, without knowledge. And that seemed to be absent. And was that because of their faith, that they just thought that, God was going to take care of them, whereas God had been absent for them for all of these? I mean, it didn't seem real to me that you wouldn't be having those kinds of discussions.
I think that you have to consider this as a work of art.
Yeah.
And a work of art stands by itself. You have to forget everything. You should just consider what you saw during that time period. That's what is important. The idea that we saw these women struggling with an issue, and we heard coherent statements, and we've discussed what they said. All this other stuff is irrelevant. When you look at a piece of art hanging on the wall, you have to consider what is in front of you. You may consider the time period in which it was made. but what you have is what is in front of you and what emotional effect it created. That's how you judge a work of art. You don't have to know who the author was. You don't have to know where they live. What you, in a book, what you read and how it made you feel. In a movie, during that 2-hour period, what did the artist, the filmmaker, achieve? And all the rest of this, whether it's true or not, does not matter. It's what the impact, and will you, and what another thing the work of art has to do is stand the test of time. In 10 years, what film will you remember? And that's what counts.
Maverick, of course. Kimberly, you had your hand raised. Love to hear.
Yeah,
from you.
I just wanted to say, first of all, I love the film. But secondly, I didn't see it as so much about the men. I didn't see where they had relationships with the men. I didn't hear them say, oh, I could never live without Tom or Bob or whatever his name is, but they said they had to have their children. And to me, what I saw was that the movie was about faith and the question of where was God? And even with the counting on the board, you know, it was, do we stay and accept this as the way of God? Do we stay and say we want to change it? Or do we leave on faith and figure it out later? But I just saw that it was really questioning one's faith more so than, because that was what they had believed for so long. And that was
Right.
a challenge to deal with.
Right. And that's why it was so difficult for them to leave, because it challenged a fundamental part of their upbringing and this religion that they sincerely and passionately believed in. There was one interesting line to chime in on that. I think Ona says this: we do not need permission to leave. An omnipotent God has not protected us, so the end justifies the means. So again, this is kind of like Jewish reform interpretation here, the questioning of God. You know, where was God? How could he allow this to happen? How could he allow the Holocaust to happen, or slavery? You know, where was God when the chips were down and humanity was being abused? So their faith was tested. You're so right about that. There's something else that I wanted to bring up. With Ona, she says at one point, if I stay in the community, they'll take my child from me and give the child to another family. So not only was she raped, she loses a child she carried to term. And she's already said, I love this child more than I ever thought I could already. You know, so that says the writing on the wall for her. And she also says, the voice of optimism, well, if we go, this is when she was considering what are our options if we go. She said, if we leave, maybe we could create some new kind of religion based on love. In other words, women can have an effect upon the severity of the rules so that they can allow for more love, or deal with the lack of love better than just assigning roles to people. And then very important, silence of not talking about it is the horror. And those of you who've had silent families for one reason or another, it's terrible not being able to talk to your family about it. And this is, sure, it's about bodies and about what a relative did to you or somebody you knew in the community, but still, that restriction makes you feel very alone and isolated. And that's what a lot of children feel like too, when their families are divided, when there's terrible poverty, when there's a loss. That aloneness is probably the horror. Okay, we're kind of closing in on the hour now. Does anybody want to add anything?
I would like to.
Okay, go ahead.
I wanted to point out 3 things. One, the name of the movie is Women Talking, and that is essential. The second thing I want to say, if anybody in this group who's ever belonged to a women's group will know that women can move mountains. And that third thing I want to point out to those people who feel that these women didn't know anything, you're forgetting one important thing. These were intelligent human beings, and they could figure out what they needed to figure out, and they knew it. And I wanted to give credit for those women, true or not, whether the story is true or not. These are three universal truths.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's
Thank
great
you.
observation. Okay, so I think our next event is going to be on April 1st, no fooling, and on the 15th. Again, I'm waiting for all those juicy Academy Award films to become available easily for you, like Living with Bill Nye, and maybe we'll do some of the riskier ones. I don't know what your appetite is for some of them, but we will not show Top Gun Maverick, I promise.
I'm glad.
What do you consider some of the ones, the riskier
The risky
ones?
one is Triangle of Sadness. It's a very political, ideological debate about capitalism and class struggle. And it takes too long. And the opening third is like way too long. And but it ends with the last 30 minutes or 45 minutes, really powerful. It's like Lord of the Flies with people lost on an island, you know, just fighting for survival. And
Where are you leaning in terms of?
Too many different ways. There are just so many options. You know, I do recommend She Said, about the Harvey Weinstein investigative reporters who broke the story years ago. And it's a procedural. Argentina 1985, it's a legal procedural. The good guys win the trial, but it's cute, you know, and it does inform you of what happens when the government restricts the courts, as happened in Argentina for, what is it, 16 years or something, when Pinochet was in power. Stacy? Yeah.
Jim, do you have any specific criteria that you use when you decide what film to show?
Yeah. First, it has to be a film that will provoke discussion.
Okay.
So light comedies, you know, I wasn't even going to show Enemies, a Love Story, but we loved it, you know, because it was kind of one note. It was Mazursky, but it resonated with us because the profiles of the immigrants to New York post-war were so real. So it has to provoke discussion and have meaningful things to discuss. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be oblique or hard to understand to do that. We saw a Song of Names about one friend chasing after another who disappeared, only to find out he went underground into the Hasidic community because he lost his parents in the Holocaust, you know, when they were childhood friends, or those who remained, about the Hungarian 18-year-old who befriends a 42-year-old doctor, and they each lost their family in the Holocaust, who became soulmates, platonic soulmates. Rich movies with great portrayals. Another great one we discussed, and I highly recommend it, is called Corpus Christi, about a young guy in Poland who was sent to jail for a murder, a gang murder, but wants to be a priest, and he goes to on a work furlough. He goes to a small town, and he kind of cures the small town of this disaster that beset everybody. And he's chased out of town because he was impersonating a priest to do it. But you know, complex films that have so many different aspects to it, interesting characters to pursue. They also have to be well made, right? So if this was just women talking, you know, and saying anything, I wouldn't have programmed it. But what they were saying was really important to hear, and how they said it. It doesn't have to be a message movie. There are a couple I'm thinking of that are kind of fun. Sometimes they're philosophical. There's an early Warren Beatty movie called Mickey One from the early 60s, black and white film. That's really all about social isolation and paranoia, and where is there any security in the world. We saw a film called The Photograph about two young, maybe lovers in India, about a young man whose grandmother's coming to visit, and he needs a girlfriend because he's been writing phony letters home about how he's engaged. So it's slightly funny. The grandmother's a hoot, but it's really all about their relationship and the growth of the relationship between the young man and the young woman. So it's got to be about something that's vaguely interesting, but it has to take a path that none of us would expect. And that's what hooks us in. We even saw Fisherman's Friend. By the way, there's a sequel to Fisherman's Friend that's floating around called Fisherman's Friends 2, TOO, about a fishing community in Cornwall, in England. And the fishermen sing sea shanties, and a record executive hears them and drives them to the top of the charts in England. And it's all about the relationships that happen between the recording executive and a woman on the island, and the fate of the fishermen and the town. It just becomes this wonderful world that we can immerse in. And we had a great time talking about how filmmakers foresee our bonding with characters and how they create relationships for us to believe in. So, does that help, Stacy? I take suggestions, I'll steal from the best. I see, more movies than I should every week, scrounging for something that's really good. We just saw The Hustler 2 weeks ago with Paul Newman and Jackie Gleason, which we all thought was a great movie. And it's all about using other people.
Right.
So it's a morality play. I like morality plays and plays about ethics, and anything's good. Try and make them current. So I'll certainly choose some of the Academy Award nominees. All right. Well,
The Banshees of Inisherin.
yeah, people love that film. I didn't. I didn't finish watching it. I thought it was too slow. And I said, oh, my group will never like this. So forgive me if you loved it, because I know a lot of people did. They found it charming. Maybe I had too much coffee that night, and I just, was ahead of the movie. Maybe I should watch it again. But it would, we've done other small films like Fisherman's Friend, small British films and Indian films. Desire to Leave, which is a Korean film, again, like Parasite, different filmmaker. We're going to see that. It's about a man who investigates several murders, and each of the two murders leads back to the same woman who was married to the men, and he falls in love with her. And it's very rich in a Korean Japanese way, like the other one, not Parasite, but what was the other one we saw? I forget. They blend. We're over 65 films.
Is that The Driver, I think?
I Drive My Car, right.
Drive My Car.
I kind of like neorealist and realistic understated films where the people are just allowed to live. We saw Secrets and Lies about a white woman who gave birth to a black daughter, but never saw the black daughter because the nuns took her away. And they reunite 25 years later, and it's all about the families. The white woman's family is accepting this daughter whom the birth mother has embraced. And, whatever's going to move people is what I'll be drawn to. So end of lecture, but there's never ending source of films, either old ones or current ones. So I try not to disappoint. Okay, so I'll look for my email, and thanks for the lively discussion. I'm not surprised. And we'll talk very soon. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.